My name is Mark. I'm 73 years old and spent 45 years climbing the corporate ladder. I thought I was building a successful life. What I was actually doing was paying hidden costs I never calculated. Retirement didn't teach me how to relax. It taught me what I had unknowingly sacrificed. I started working at Morrison Manufacturing in 1972, fresh out of college with my engineering degree and a head full of dreams. I was 22 years old, eager to prove myself and completely convinced that I understood how life worked. The equation seemed simple enough: hard work plus time equals success and happiness. I believed this with the same certainty that I believed the sun would rise each morning. My first cubicle was in the corner of a fluorescent lit floor, surrounded by men who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I showed up every morning at 7:30 sharp, stayed until 6, and felt proud of my dedication. My supervisor, a gruff man in his 50s, noticed my work ethic within the first month. He pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "Mark, you've got the hunger. That's what separates the men from the boys in this business." Those words lit something inside me. I wasn't just working anymore, I was proving something. Every project became a test, every deadline a chance to demonstrate my worth. When my colleagues left at 5, I stayed until 6. When they worked weekends occasionally, I worked weekends regularly. I told myself I was investing in my future, building something meaningful. The validation came faster than I expected. At 25, just 3 years into my career, I was promoted to team leader. The raise was substantial, more money than I had ever imagined having. I remember calling my parents from the office phone, my voice shaking with excitement as I told them about the promotion. My father's pride was evident even through the crackling long distance connection. "Son," he said, "you're going places." With that first promotion came my first taste of lifestyle inflation. I moved out of my studio apartment into a one bedroom with actual space. I bought my first new car, a blue Ford sedan that made me feel like I had finally arrived. The monthly payments felt manageable, even reasonable against my new salary. I was living the American dream, or so I thought. It was at the company Christmas party in 1974 that I met Sarah. She worked in accounting, had a laugh that could fill a room, and wore a red dress that made every other woman at the party fade into the background. We talked for 3 hours straight about everything and nothing. She was smart, funny, and seemed genuinely impressed by my recent promotion. When I drove her home that night, I knew I was going to marry her. Our courtship was a whirlwind of weekend dinners and late night phone calls. Sarah understood my ambition because she had her own. She was working toward her CPA license, putting in long hours, just like I was. We bonded over our shared drive, our mutual understanding that success required sacrifice. We were both climbing our respective ladders, and it felt like we were climbing them together. I proposed to Sarah in 1976 on a Saturday afternoon in the park where we had our first official date. She said yes before I finished asking the question. We were married 8 months later in a ceremony that felt like a celebration of everything we were building together. I was 28, she was 26, and we felt invincible. The house came next, a modest 3 bedroom ranch in a good neighborhood with good schools. The mortgage application process was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. When the loan officer approved our application, I felt like I had crossed some invisible threshold into real adulthood. We were homeowners now, stakeholders in the American dream. Our first child, Michael was born in 1978. Holding him in the hospital room, feeling his tiny weight in my arms, I understood responsibility in a way I never had before. This little person was depending on me to provide, to create security, to build a life that would give him every opportunity I never had. When Sarah and I brought him home to the nursery, we had painted yellow because we wanted to be surprised. I made a silent promise that I would give him everything. 2 years later, Jennifer arrived, and our family felt complete. Sarah took maternity leave both times, and I worked extra hours to compensate for her temporary absence from her own career. It seemed natural, responsible even. I was the breadwinner now, and breadwinning required dedication. My promotion to department manager came when Michael was 3 and Jennifer was 1. I was now responsible for 20 employees, overseeing production schedules, managing budgets, and reporting directly to the plant director. The salary bump was significant, enough to cover the increased mortgage payments when we refinanced to add a family room. The extra space felt necessary with 2 growing children, but with the promotion came longer hours and greater responsibility. The plant operated on tight margins, and any production delays cost the company thousands of dollars per day. I found myself staying later to ensure everything ran smoothly, coming in on Saturdays to catch up on administrative work and bringing home project files to review after the children were in bed. Sarah was understanding at first. She knew I was working hard for our family's future. When I missed dinner because of an emergency meeting, she kept the plate warm for me. When I worked through the weekend because we were behind on a major order, she handled the children's activities alone. I told myself I was working for my family, not realizing I was working myself away from them. Think about your own life right now. When did providing for loved ones become a substitute for being present with them? When did the means become more important than the end? I wish I had asked myself these questions at 30 instead of at 70. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in 1987. I was 35 years old, sitting in my department manager office reviewing production reports when my boss called me upstairs. The corporate headquarters had been watching our plant's performance, and they were impressed. They wanted to offer me the regional manager position, overseeing operations across 3 states. The salary increase was staggering. 70% more than I was currently making, plus a company car, plus stock options that could set our family up for life. I sat in that conference room listening to the offer, and all I could think about was financial security, college funds for Michael and Jennifer, the ability to pay off our mortgage early, maybe even a vacation home someday. But there was a catch. The position required relocating to Denver. Sarah and I would have to uproot our entire life, sell the house we had worked so hard to buy, and move the children away from the only home they had ever known. Michael was 9 and had just made the baseball team. Jennifer was 7 and had best friends she played with every afternoon. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table with Sarah, spreading out the offer letter and the relocation package details. She read through everything twice before looking up at me. Her expression was careful, measured. "It's a lot of money," she said quietly, "but it's also a lot of change." The children were resistant from the start. Michael cried when we told him about the potential move. He had finally found his place on the baseball team, had friends who included him, and couldn't understand why we would leave all of that behind. Jennifer was confused, asking if we had done something wrong that meant we had to leave our house. I convinced them it was for our future. I used that phrase repeatedly over the following weeks as we discussed the decision. This is for our future, I would say, when Sarah expressed concerns about leaving her job and starting over in a new city. This is for our future, I told the children when they asked why we couldn't just stay where we were happy. The phrase became my shield against doubt, my answer to every question, my justification for every sacrifice I was asking them to make. I genuinely believed it was true. I was making a strategic decision for our family's long term benefit, even if it caused short term discomfort. We moved to Denver in the summer of 1987, and I threw myself into the new position with an intensity that surprised even me. I was now managing 5 departments across 3 states, which meant constant travel. Monday mornings often found me on planes to Phoenix or Salt Lake City. I would return home Thursday evenings exhausted and mentally drained, only to spend Friday catching up on administrative work in the Denver office. The travel schedule meant I was physically absent from home 3 to 4 days every week. But even when I was home, I wasn't really present. My mind was constantly processing the problems and opportunities across my region. During family dinners, I would find myself mentally calculating production schedules or worrying about personnel issues in Phoenix. Sarah adapted to my absence by becoming incredibly self sufficient. She handled the children's school enrollment, found new doctors and dentists, managed the household finances, and basically ran our family life as a single parent 4 days a week. When I complimented her on how well she was managing everything, she smiled. But I noticed the smile didn't reach her eyes. My identity began to merge with my job title in ways I didn't recognize at the time. I started introducing myself at social gatherings as Mark Johnson, regional manager for Morrison Manufacturing. Business cards became precious commodities that I handed out at neighborhood barbecues and parent teacher conferences. The corner office, with its view of the Rocky Mountains, became my second home. Vacations became an exercise in compromise. Even when we managed to plan family trips, I brought work along. I would spend early mornings in hotel rooms on conference calls with the Phoenix team, or excuse myself from beach time to handle what I deemed urgent situations. Sarah stopped complaining about these interruptions because she knew it wouldn't change anything. I measured my worth by the density of my calendar and the urgency of my phone calls. A day without crisis felt like a day I wasn't adding value to the company. I started arriving at the office by 6 in the morning and leaving after 7 at night, even on the days I wasn't traveling. 60-hour weeks became my minimum standard, and 70-hour weeks felt like proof of my dedication. The company rewarded this behavior with more responsibility and more recognition. I was invited to corporate strategy meetings, asked to present at industry conferences, and consulted on major decisions that affected the entire Western Division. Each new responsibility felt like validation that I was on the right path. But the subtle erosions were happening simultaneously, so gradually that I didn't notice them until years later. Michael's baseball games happened without me in the stands. His coach stopped asking if I would be able to make the games because the answer was always the same. Sarah attended every game, cheering loudly enough for both of us, but I can only imagine how it felt to always be alone in those bleachers. Jennifer's dance recitals became Sarah's domain as well. I missed 3 consecutive annual recitals because they fell during budget planning season, when I was traveling constantly to review departmental projections. Jennifer stopped asking if I would be there because she learned not to expect it. Our dinner conversations became logistical briefings rather than family connection time. Sarah would update me on the children's schedules, school events, and household needs. I would share highlights from my business travels, but mostly I was mentally preparing for the next day's challenges. We were functioning as a family, but we weren't connecting as one. I told myself this was temporary sacrifice for permanent gain. I convinced myself that the security I was building through my career success would benefit my family for generations. I believed that my children would thank me someday for the opportunities my hard work was creating for them. These weren't lies I told others. They were lies I told myself, and I believed them completely. July the 2nd, 2006. I can still recall every detail of that morning with perfect clarity, even 17 years later. It was a Tuesday, and I was supposed to be in Phoenix by noon for what I had convinced myself was a critical client meeting. Hartwell Industries was threatening to take their business elsewhere, and as regional manager, I was the only one who could salvage the relationship. At least that's what I told myself as I rushed through my morning routine. I had flown back from Salt Lake City the night before on the last flight out, landing in Denver just after midnight. Sarah was already asleep when I got home, and I spent another hour in my home office reviewing client files and preparing talking points for the Phoenix meeting. I finally fell into bed around 2 in the morning, knowing I had to be back at the airport by 7. My alarm went off at 5:30. 4 hours of sleep was becoming normal for me during busy periods, which seemed to be most periods. I had developed a routine of functioning on coffee and adrenaline, telling myself that executive level responsibility required this kind of sacrifice. Sarah stirred when the alarm went off but didn't say anything. She had learned not to complain about my schedule because it never changed anything. I was driving my company car, a dark blue sedan that I had grown to hate because it represented so many hours away from home. The interstate was relatively empty at 7 in the morning, which I appreciated because it meant I could make good time to the airport. I had a hands-free phone call scheduled with the Phoenix team during the drive, so I could maximize my productivity even during travel time. What I remember most clearly is feeling exhausted but wired at the same time. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind was racing with everything I needed to accomplish that day. The Hartwell meeting was just the beginning. I had 3 other client calls scheduled for the afternoon, plus a dinner meeting with potential new partners. It was going to be a 16-hour day, but that felt normal. I was about 20 minutes into the drive, going 70 miles per hour in the left lane, when it happened. One moment I was mentally rehearsing my opening remarks for the Hartwell presentation, and the next moment I was waking up, hanging upside down in my car. The vehicle had drifted off the interstate into the median strip and rolled twice before coming to rest upside down against a concrete barrier. I had fallen asleep at the wheel at 9:30 in the morning, something I would have sworn was impossible. But my body had finally overruled my will, and physics took over where determination failed. I remember the strange silence after the rolling stopped. My seatbelt was cutting into my shoulder. Blood was dripping from my forehead onto the roof of the car, and I could smell gasoline. For a few seconds, I couldn't process what had happened. Then the reality hit me like a physical blow. I had fallen asleep while driving 70 miles per hour on a major interstate. A truck driver who witnessed the accident called 911 and stayed with me until the emergency responders arrived. He kept talking to me through the shattered window, making sure I stayed conscious while the fire department worked to extract me from the wreckage. "You're lucky to be alive," he kept saying. "I've seen accidents like this before, and most people don't walk away." The paramedics transported me to Denver General Hospital, where I spent the next 6 hours undergoing tests and procedures. I had a concussion, several lacerations, and what the doctor called severe exhaustion. When I tried to explain that I needed to get to Phoenix for my meeting, the emergency room physician looked at me like I was insane. Sarah arrived at the hospital within an hour, and I could see the fear and anger warring in her expression. She had received the call from the highway patrol while she was getting the children ready for school. Michael was now 18 and about to start his senior year of high school. Jennifer was 16 and had her driver's license. They both came to the hospital after school, and seeing their faces when they walked into my room broke something inside me. "Dad," Michael said, his voice shaking, "I thought we lost you." He was trying to be strong, but I could see tears in his eyes. Jennifer sat on the edge of my hospital bed and made me promise to be around more. Those 3 words contained years of unspoken disappointment and longing. Sarah held my hand and said the words that should have changed everything. "The meeting wasn't worth this. No meeting is worth this." She was right, and I knew she was right, but I still found myself thinking about how I was going to reschedule the Harwell presentation. For the next 48 hours, lying in that hospital bed with an IV in my arm and monitors beeping around me, I experienced something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. Without the constant noise of phones and emails and urgent deadlines, I could see my life from a different perspective. I saw how my family had organized their entire existence around my absence. I saw how my children had learned not to expect me at their important moments because disappointment was easier to handle than hope. I made promises during those 2 days that I absolutely meant at the time. I promised Sarah I would restructure my priorities. I promised Michael I would be at his graduation. I promised Jennifer I would teach her to drive stick shift like I had always said I would. I swore to myself that I would use this accident as a catalyst for fundamental change in how I approached work and family. The conversations we had during my hospital stay were deeper and more honest than any we had shared in years. We talked about dreams and fears and regrets. Sarah told me she missed the man I used to be, the one who used to notice sunsets and tell jokes at dinner. The children shared stories about school and friends and hopes for the future. For 48 hours, we were a family reconnecting instead of roommates coordinating schedules. I was released from the hospital on Thursday afternoon with strict instructions to rest for 2 weeks. No driving, no work, no stress. The doctor told Sarah privately that I was exhibiting signs of chronic stress that could lead to serious health problems if I didn't make significant lifestyle changes. For exactly 2 weeks, I followed those instructions. I slept 8 hours every night. I ate meals with my family without checking my phone. I helped Jennifer with her algebra homework. I had actual conversations with Sarah about things other than logistics. I felt like I was remembering how to be human instead of just being productive. But then the phone calls from work started. Nothing urgent, my boss assured me. Just some questions about the Phoenix accounts. Could I just take a quick look at some contracts? Would I mind joining a conference call to provide context on a client situation? Each request seemed reasonable and temporary. By the end of my third week of recovery, I was back to working 50-hour weeks. By the end of the first month, I was traveling again. Within 60 days, it was as if the accident had never happened, except for the scar on my forehead that served as a permanent reminder of my mortality. Ask yourself this question: what wake up calls in your own life have you treated like snooze buttons? What moments of clarity have you allowed the noise of daily urgency to drown out? I turned that accident into just another story I told at networking events, a dramatic anecdote about the unpredictability of life rather than a clear warning about the unsustainability of my choices. The accident should have changed everything. Instead, it became just another item on my resume of surviving challenges and getting back to business. That might have been the biggest mistake of my entire career. 2 years after the accident that should have changed my life, the ultimate opportunity presented itself. In 2008, at age 53, I was offered the position I had been unconsciously working toward for 30 years: Vice President of Western Operations for Morrison Manufacturing. The salary was $300,000 annually, plus stock options that could potentially be worth millions, plus executive benefits that included everything from a company jet allowance to a full executive health plan. This was everything I had sacrificed for, everything I had told myself I was building toward during all those missed dinners and postponed family moments. When the CEO called me into his office and made the offer, I felt a rush of validation that was almost intoxicating. 30 years of 60-hour weeks, countless business trips, and relentless dedication had led to this moment. I was being invited to join the executive tier of a Fortune 500 company. Sarah's reaction when I told her about the offer was complicated in a way that should have given me pause. She was proud of me, genuinely happy that my hard work was being recognized at the highest levels. But underneath the congratulations, I could see concern in her eyes. More responsibility means more hours, she said quietly. When will it be enough? I assured her that this was the final climb. Once I established myself at the VP level, I could delegate more, effectively and actually work fewer hours while earning significantly more money. The executive position would give me the authority to build the team I needed to handle day-to-day operations while I focus on strategic planning. It was a persuasive argument, and I believed it myself. The reality of executive level responsibility was far different from my expectations. As Vice President of Western Operations, I was now accountable for the performance of 12 manufacturing facilities across 6 states. I had a direct reporting relationship to the board of directors and was expected to present quarterly results to investors. The success or failure of operations that employed over 3,000 people rested on my decisions. My new office was on the 32nd floor of the downtown Denver corporate tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains. I had an executive assistant who managed my calendar and a secretary who handled my correspondence. The corner office came with its own conference table and enough space to host meetings with visiting executives from other divisions. But with the prestige came expectations that redefined what I thought I knew about work pressure. Board meetings were scheduled monthly, but preparation for each meeting required weeks of analysis and reporting. Investor calls happened quarterly, but the financial scrutiny meant I needed to understand every aspect of operations in granular detail. Strategic planning sessions could run 12 hours over multiple days, with breaks only for meals that were working meals. The 24/7 availability that had been implied at lower levels became explicitly expected at the executive level. I carried three phones: my regular cell phone, a secure company phone for sensitive communications, and a satellite phone for areas with poor coverage during site visits. I checked emails during church services, took calls during family dinners, and participated in conference calls from vacation hotels. My travel schedule intensified beyond anything I had experienced before. Site visits to all 12 facilities were required quarterly, which meant I was traveling at least 1 week per month, often two. Emergency situations could call me away with just a few hours' notice. When the Phoenix plant had major equipment failure that threatened to shut down production for a key client, I was on a plane within 4 hours, regardless of what family commitments I was abandoning. The health consequences of this lifestyle became impossible to ignore, though I tried my best to do exactly that. At my annual executive physical in 2010, my doctor prescribed blood pressure medication and expressed serious concern about my stress levels and weight gain. I was 40 pounds heavier than I had been at age 40. My cholesterol was elevated, and my resting heart rate suggested chronic stress was taking a measurable toll on my cardiovascular system. Sleep became something I scheduled rather than something that happened naturally. I relied on prescription sleeping pills to fall asleep and multiple cups of coffee plus energy drinks to function during the day. My typical schedule involved falling asleep around midnight after reviewing reports and waking up at 5 to prepare for early morning calls with East Coast clients or international partners. The isolation that came with executive success was something no one had warned me about. My peers were now other VPs and C suite executives, most of whom were equally consumed by their professional responsibilities. Our conversations, even during social events, revolve around market conditions, regulatory challenges, and strategic opportunities. I had lost the ability to engage in casual conversation about sports, hobbies, or current events because I no longer had time to follow anything that wasn't directly related to business. My relationship with my family became increasingly transactional. Sarah and I communicated primarily through text messages and voicemails, coordinating schedules and sharing logistical information. Our dinner conversations, when I was actually home for dinner, consisted of status updates rather than emotional connection. She would update me on the children's activities and household needs, while I shared abbreviated versions of my business challenges and travel schedule. Michael graduated from high school in 2009, and while I attended the ceremony, I spent most of the reception on a conference call dealing with a labor dispute at the Salt Lake City facility. The photograph from that day shows me standing next to my son in his graduation cap and gown, but I'm clearly distracted, looking at my phone instead of celebrating his achievement. Jennifer's teenage years were happening without my involvement in ways that became painfully clear during my rare moments of presence. She had learned to drive without my instruction, chosen her college major without my input, and navigated the typical challenges of adolescence with Sarah as her primary guide. When I tried to engage in father daughter conversations, she was polite but distant, treating me more like a family friend than a parent. The executive perks that were supposed to compensate for these sacrifices felt hollow even as I enjoyed them. First class travel was comfortable, but it was still time away from home. The corporate box at sporting events was impressive, but I usually attended these events alone or with clients rather than family. The country club membership came with a golf course. I rarely had time to play, and dining facilities I used primarily for business meetings. I had achieved the success I had dreamed of at 22, but the victory felt Pyrrhic in ways I couldn't articulate at the time. I was earning more money than I had ever imagined possible, wielding influence over major business decisions, and receiving recognition from industry leaders. By every external measure, I had won the game I had been playing for 30 years. Yet I was successful by every external measure and empty by every internal one. I lived in the same house as my family, but led a completely separate life. I was providing financial security for people I barely knew anymore, working to support a lifestyle I never had time to enjoy. The irony was devastating, though I wouldn't recognize it fully for another decade. I had spent 30 years climbing toward a position that required sacrificing everything the position was supposed to provide for. The retirement decision came in 2016 when Morrison Manufacturing offered early retirement packages to senior executives as part of corporate restructuring. I was 67 years old and had spent 44 years with the company, climbing from entry level engineer to vice president. My financial advisor ran the numbers 3 times before confirming what seemed impossible. I could retire immediately and maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely. I expected to feel relief when I signed the retirement papers. Instead, sitting in my corner office for the last time, boxing up decades of awards and business cards, I felt something closer to terror. Who was Mark without the title? What was my identity without the morning meetings and quarterly reports and strategic planning sessions that had defined my existence for nearly half a century? The retirement party was held in the executive conference room, where I had presented hundreds of quarterly reports. Colleagues gave speeches about my dedication and achievements. The CEO presented me with a crystal plaque recognizing my unwavering commitment to excellence. Sarah smiled and applauded, but I caught her glancing at her watch during the ceremony. Even my retirement celebration felt like another business meeting she was obligated to attend. My first month of retirement was a masterclass in withdrawal symptoms. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, my body trained by decades of routine, but had nowhere to go and nothing urgent to accomplish. The silence in our house was deafening. Sarah had her own routines developed over years of managing our household essentially as a single person, and my constant presence disrupted the rhythm she had established. I checked my empty work email obsessively, refreshing the inbox every few minutes as if urgent messages might magically appear. I followed Morrison Manufacturing stock price daily, reading quarterly reports from my former division with the intensity of someone studying for a final exam. I called my replacement with suggestions and insights until Sarah gently suggested I was becoming a nuisance to people who were trying to do their jobs. The identity crisis was profound and immediate. For 44 years, I had introduced myself with my job title. At social gatherings, grocery stores, and casual encounters, I was Mark Johnson, Vice President of Western Operations. Without that title, I struggled to explain who I was or what I did. I'm retired felt like admitting I was no longer useful to society. But the retirement crisis was nothing compared to what I discovered when I turned my attention to the relationships I had neglected for decades. Sarah and I were living like polite strangers who happened to share a mortgage. We had separate morning routines, separate interests, and surprisingly little to talk about when work topics were off the table. Our conversations had become so focused on logistics and scheduling over the years that we had forgotten how to simply enjoy each other's company. When I suggested we take a trip together, she agreed, but the planning process revealed how little we knew about each other's preferences anymore. I didn't know what kind of music she liked, what books she read, or what she dreamed about during the quiet moments I had never been present for. The damage to my relationships with my children was even more devastating to confront. Michael was now 38 years old, married with two children of his own, living a full and successful life that had developed almost entirely without my input or presence. When I called to suggest we spend more time together, he was polite but distant. He had learned long ago not to count on his father's availability, and rebuilding that trust would require more than good intentions. Our interactions felt formal, almost transactional. He would update me on his work and his children's activities, but these felt like reports rather than conversations between father and son. When I offered advice about parenting or career decisions, he listened respectfully, but clearly didn't value my input the way I had once valued my own father's guidance. I was a peripheral figure in my son's life, someone he dutifully kept informed, but didn't naturally turn to for support or wisdom. Jennifer was 33 and had recently gotten engaged to a man I had met exactly twice. She was excited about her upcoming wedding and had strong opinions about everything from the venue to the flowers, but she didn't seek my input on any of the decisions. When I offered to help with wedding planning, she thanked me, but explained that she and her mother already had everything under control. The realization that I barely knew my own children was crushing. Jennifer's career in marketing was successful and fulfilling, but I couldn't describe what her typical workday involved or what challenges she faced in her industry. Michael's interests outside of work were a mystery to me. I didn't know their favorite restaurants, their political opinions, or their hopes for the future. Most heartbreaking of all was my relationship with my grandchildren. Michael's son was 8 and his daughter was 6, ages when children are naturally curious and affectionate with grandparents who are present and engaged. But I was essentially a stranger who showed up occasionally with expensive gifts and awkward attempts at conversation. They were polite to me because their parents had taught them good manners, but there was no natural bond, no shared history of bedtime stories or playground visits or quiet conversations. Look inside your own heart right now. What relationships in your life are you assuming will wait for you until you have time to nurture them properly? What connections are you taking for granted while you focus on more urgent priorities? The physical consequences of 44 years of chronic stress could no longer be hidden behind busy schedules and adrenaline. Without the constant stimulation of work crises, my body began to show signs of the damage I had inflicted through decades of neglect. Chronic fatigue that I had attributed to temporary busy periods revealed itself as a permanent condition. Sleep disorders that I had managed with prescription medications became impossible to ignore when I actually had time to sleep. My doctor's assessment during my first post retirement physical was sobering. High blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, signs of early heart disease, and what he diplomatically called accelerated aging from chronic stress. Your body is older than your chronological age, he explained. The good news is that retirement should help reverse some of this damage, but you'll need to be patient. It took decades to create these problems. The emotional reckoning was even more difficult than the physical one. I spent hours alone in my home office, surrounded by awards and photographs from company events, trying to calculate what all those years of sacrifice had actually produced. I had a comfortable retirement account, a paid off house, and enough financial security to last the rest of my life. But I was emotionally impoverished in ways that money couldn't address. I realized I had spent 45 years building someone else's empire while neglecting my own kingdom. Morrison Manufacturing would continue to operate successfully without me, but the family, relationships I had sacrificed for that success couldn't be rebuilt with the same strategic planning and dedicated effort that had driven my career advancement. The grief I experienced during my first year of retirement was unlike anything I had felt before. I was mourning the father I had never been, grieving the husband I could have been, and regretting experiences that couldn't be recovered or recreated. I was grieving my own choices while still being alive to see their consequences. At 67, I had financial security but relational poverty. I had time abundance but energy depletion. I had saved money but spent my life force. I had achieved everything I thought I wanted and discovered that what I actually needed had been available all along if only I had been present enough to recognize it. 6 years have passed since that first devastating year of retirement, and I can honestly say that the period from age 67 to 73 has been my graduate education in actually living. The reconstruction of my life didn't happen overnight, and it required a level of humility and patience that my career driven personality had never developed. Learning to be present without an agenda became my most challenging assignment. The first lesson I had to master was the difference between time and energy. During my working years, I had become obsessed with time management, believing that efficiency was the key to success. I scheduled every moment, multitasked relentlessly, and measured my worth by how much I could accomplish in a single day. But retirement taught me that having abundant time means nothing if you lack the energy to fully engage with it. I had saved time by working efficiently, but I had spent my life forced working constantly. Those 20 years of retirement I had planned for were compromised by decades of accumulated fatigue, stress related health problems, and the emotional exhaustion that comes from years of surface level living. I had more hours available than ever before, but I was running on empty in ways that couldn't be fixed with better scheduling. Recovery required me to rebuild my physical and emotional energy from the ground up. I started with sleep, something I had treated as an inconvenient necessity for decades. Learning to sleep without medication took months. My body had to remember what natural rest felt like after years of pharmaceutical assistance and stress induced insomnia. Gradually, as my sleep improved, my energy began to return in small increments. The relationship reconstruction was even more delicate and time consuming. Sarah and I essentially had to relearn how to be married to each other rather than simply managing a household together. We started with coffee in the morning, sitting at our kitchen table with our phones or newspapers or any agenda other than talking to each other. Those early conversations were awkward and stilted, but gradually we began to remember why we had fallen in love 40 years earlier. Trust, I discovered, erodes gradually but rebuilds even more slowly. Sarah had spent decades adapting to my absence and learning not to depend on me for emotional support or daily partnership. Convincing her that I was genuinely committed to being present required consistent actions over many months, not grand gestures or promises about the future. We started taking evening walks around our neighborhood, something we hadn't done since the children were small. During these walks, without the distractions of television or household tasks, we began to rediscover each other's thoughts and dreams. Sarah told me about books she was reading, friends she had cultivated during my absent years, and interests she had developed while I was building my career. I realized I was getting to know a woman I had lived with for 40 years, but had stopped paying attention to decades earlier. Rebuilding my relationship with Michael required even more patience and humility. He had learned to be suspicious of my commitments because I had broken so many promises during his childhood and adolescence. When I suggested we meet for lunch once a week, he agreed reluctantly, clearly expecting me to cancel these meetings when something more important came up. For the first 6 months, our weekly lunches felt like obligatory visits rather than genuine connection. Michael would update me on his work and his children's activities, but these conversations remained at surface level. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to give advice and started asking questions about his experiences and perspectives. Instead of positioning myself as the wise father sharing life lessons, I began approaching him as an adult whose insights I genuinely valued. Learning to be a grandfather at age 67 was perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my reconstruction process. Michael's children, initially shy around this stranger who claimed to be their grandfather, gradually warmed up to my presence as I became more consistent and reliable. I started picking up my granddaughter from school once a week, giving us uninterrupted time to talk about her day, her friends, and her thoughts about everything from homework to hopes for the future. These conversations with my 8-year-old granddaughter taught me more about presence and attention than any business seminar ever had. Children have no tolerance for distracted listening or multitasking. When she was telling me about a disagreement with a friend or excitement about a school project, she demanded and deserved my complete focus. Learning to give this kind of attention felt like developing a muscle I had allowed to atrophy for decades. Jennifer's wedding planning became an opportunity for us to connect in ways we had missed during her teenage years. Instead of trying to take charge or impose my opinions, I asked her to teach me about her vision for the ceremony and reception. I spent afternoons helping her research venues and vendors, not because she needed my assistance, but because this task gave us time to talk about her relationship, her hopes for marriage, and her reflections on the family she had grown up in. The conversations during wedding planning were sometimes difficult. Jennifer shared memories of feeling disappointed by my absences during her childhood, and she expressed concerns about whether her fiance would be the kind of present partner she hoped for. These discussions required me to listen without becoming defensive, to acknowledge the impact of my choices without making excuses, and to support her decisions without trying to compensate for my past failures through current involvement. My health recovery was slower but more complete than I had expected. The chronic stress symptoms that had become normal during my working years gradually diminished as my nervous system learned to relax. Blood pressure medications were reduced and eventually eliminated. Sleep quality improved dramatically once I stopped checking phones and emails in bed. The weight I had gained from years of stress eating and business dinners came off gradually as I developed regular exercise habits and actually had time to prepare and enjoy healthy meals. But the most significant change was learning to find purpose and fulfillment outside of professional achievement. I began volunteering at a local literacy program, teaching adults to read. This work was meaningful in ways that quarterly earnings reports had never been. Helping a 45-year-old single mother learn to read her children's school notices gave me a sense of contribution that felt deeper and more lasting than any business deal I had ever closed. The volunteer work also introduced me to people whose life experiences were completely different from the corporate executives I had spent decades networking with. These relationships were based on shared values and mutual respect rather than professional advancement or business opportunities. For the first time since college, I was forming friendships with people who knew nothing about my career accomplishments and cared nothing about my former job title. So I'm asking you, just as a grandfather would, what legacy are you actually creating day by day? Not the legacy you intend to create someday when you have more time or fewer responsibilities, but the legacy you're building through your daily choices about where to invest your attention and energy. Looking back on my 6 years of reconstruction, I can see that retirement became my opportunity to finally become the person I had been too busy to be during my working years. The man who notices sunsets and listens to his wife's stories and knows his grandchildren's favorite games. The man who has time for conversations that serve no purpose other than connection and who can sit quietly without feeling guilty about not being productive. At 73, I finally understand that the hidden cost of working isn't work itself, but forgetting. The work should enhance life, not replace it. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. I can't recover the years I missed, but I can make sure the years I have left truly count. This morning I had coffee with Sarah, and we planned a picnic with our grandchildren for this weekend. No agenda, no deadlines, no goals other than being present with people who matter. It's taken me 73 years to understand that this is what success actually looks like.